All right, in this second session on our study of the doctrine of God and the God that we worship, before we get into an actual survey of the names and titles of God, I want to spend one more session on background with respect to the problems that we have in understanding who God is. And so in this hour, I want to ask this question: what can we know about God? A principal doctrine that came out of the Reformation called the incomprehensibility. I hate the spell on the blackboard. Incomprehensibility. We use the whole blackboard for that. The incomprehensibility of God. Now, what does that word, incomprehensible, normally suggest to you, Jane?
Unable to comprehend or know.
Unable to comprehend or know at all, right? If something is incomprehensible, that means there's no way that we can understand it with our minds. And yet, classical Protestantism has at the heart of their theology this concept of the incomprehensibility of God. But the word in theology does not mean what the term itself may suggest at first glance. This is not saying that God is utterly unknowable, but rather it is saying that no one of us can comprehend God exhaustively. None of us has a total, comprehensive, exhaustive knowledge of who God is. And a sub-point under that, and I'm going to use a Latin phrase here, don't let it frighten anybody. Latin's perfectly harmless, but it's a very important formula that came out of the 16th century Reformation. Finitum non capax infinitum. Okay? Sometimes if we learn these Latin phrases, they become like pegs that we can hang our hats on and actually become stimuli for easier remembrances of concepts and others. And this is a very important phrase for two reasons. In fact, it's used two different ways in theology. Well, let's see first of all what it means. Finitum. Now, let's have a Latin lesson here. Dan, what does finitum mean? Finite. Finite. Okay, that's easy enough. Finite. And now we'll ask a tough one over here of our Episcopalian friends. Sarah, what does non mean?
Oh, I had 5 years of Latin.
You had 5 years of Latin, and you got that in the first lesson, didn't you? Okay. Finite, not 5 years of Latin. I'm going to come back to you. In fact, I'm going to come back to you right.
That was a long time ago.
A long time ago. Capax. This is the key word in here. Grasp or contain. And it can be used both ways, to grasp or contain. So that an infinitum, Bill, what does that mean?
Infinity.
Infinite. Okay. The finite cannot contain or grasp the infinite. First of all, let's look at it in the sense of containment. We have a little square here that is a measurable square with a definite area. We can say it's 12 inches across here. It's not a square, it's a rectangle, and say 6 inches across here. This is a finite area. Now, could we squeeze all of God into this box? You've heard the expression, so-and-so's God is too small, they have God in a box. Can we squeeze the infinite God into a finite space? No, because then God would no longer be infinite, would he? So that the finite can never contain, in the sense of embrace and envelop, the infinite. But also, since we are finite creatures, our minds work and understand always from a finite perspective. And so I can never understand God fully because God is infinite. And God lives and moves and has his being on an infinite plane. I live and move and have my being on a finite plane. And the finite cannot grasp or contain the infinite. Therefore, God is incomprehensible. Now, that concept is very important to our understanding because it represents a check and balance, a corrective to warn us lest we think we have captured altogether and mastered in every detail the things of God. We know that however we understand God, our understanding is limited by our own finitude. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this concept of the incomprehensibility of God can be abused. People can easily slide off the edge into two very serious errors. One is the one I've already alluded to, that if God is incomprehensible, then that must means he's utterly unknowable, and so that anything we say about God is just gibberish. And that's been a crucial point of debate in the 20th century. And therefore people will say, as some philosophers have said, all of your language and talk about God is merely an expression of your own humanity. There's nothing out there that you can talk about meaningfully at all except your own human responses. But not only that, since the finite cannot contain the infinite, people have developed a doctrine of God, particularly in evangelical circles, although not exclusively in evangelical circles, that God's reason is on a different plane from man's reason, so that what is irrational to man or contradictory to man may be rational to God. Now, you've heard that. I've asked this question of many, many groups that have been through the Ligonier Valley Study Center. I'll say this: can truth ever be contradictory? And I've had more evangelical Christians answer that question yes than I've ever heard from pure secularists. Evangelical Christians are wont to say, well, sure, God can do anything. God can square the circle. God can make 2 and 2 5. God can violate the law of contradiction. And God can, some things that look to us as being contradictions are perfectly rational to God. Confusing mystery with contradiction. Now, all Christians would admit that the mind cannot grasp everything there is to God, that God's being and the knowledge of God at points transcends the limits of human reason. But it's one thing to say that God transcends the limits of human reason. It's another thing to say that above the limitations of human reason, here's reason or rationality, and up here we call supra-rationality, that is, that level where we cannot penetrate through rational deduction. But it's one thing to call this level super-rationality, it's another thing to call it irrationality. Irrationality is what we call nonsense. Now, I'm using that term advisedly, nonsense. What does it mean literally? Non-sense. That is, an irrationality doesn't make sense. It cannot be conceived of by a human being. No one can have meaningful discourse or communication at the nonsense level because the mind is so structured that it cannot understand it. Because here, it's not because there's a limit of what we can penetrate with the mind, but here we believe that there's a limit not only to truth, but to reality. Let me press that a minute and ask you this question. Can truth, can reality ever be contradictory? There's a whole host of people who believe that it can, who believe that something can be in a spot and not be in a spot at the same time and in the same relationship. But Christianity at this point, though it affirms the incomprehensibility of God, nevertheless affirms the rationality of God. Now, here's where it's crucial. Our mind can only go so far in understanding God, And certainly to know God, we depend upon revelation. Okay? But that revelation is intelligible, understandable. It is not irrational. It is not gibberish. It is not nonsense. And so we move at the same time from an affirmation of the incomprehensibility of God to an affirmation of the fact that God has revealed himself. And again, in the Reformation, two concepts were very important. That God is both hidden and revealed. God is both hidden and revealed. The technical term for hiddenness is Deus absconditus. You don't have to remember that, except that it's a neat Latin term because we get an English word from it, from the word absconditus. What word do we get? Abscond. And when do we use that? When something like when the bank teller absconds with the funds. He goes into hiding. He flees where you can't find him. And so the theologians speak about the Deus absconditus, that sense in which God remains hidden to us. There is a secret, mysterious dimension of God that we do not know. However, we are not left in a cloak of darkness, groping around simply for a hidden God. God has also revealed himself, and that is basic to the Christian faith. Whatever else Christianity is a revealed religion, where we say that God, who has created us, has revealed himself manifestly in the glorious theater of nature, where one cannot be awake for 5 seconds without being bombarded with God's general revelation. But not only that, God has revealed himself verbally. He has spoken, and we have his word inscripturated in the Bible. Here we're talking about revelation. That is information that God gives to us, particularly in the Bible, special revelation, that we could never figure out on our own guesswork or playing cosmic detectives. All right? So that God is a revealed God, but he doesn't reveal everything there is to know about him. We see, as it were, in a glass darkly. What's the Old Testament passage? The secret things belong to the Lord our God. But the things that he has revealed belong to us and to our seed forever. So it's not like we have no knowledge, and it's not like we have consummate knowledge, but rather we have a working knowledge of God that is useful and vital and crucial for our lives. Now, again, when we ask this question, can we know God? The perennial problem that comes up is how can we speak about God in a meaningful way? I have a little experiment that I do frequently that I call God and ice cream cones, where I ask people if they like ice cream, and everybody likes ice cream, and I say, okay, think for a moment in your mind of your favorite kind of ice cream cone. And I ask people to go through this exercise, and then we'll pull out from the audience, and they'll say, well, pistachio nut or chocolate ripple or whatever. And I say, okay, that was an easy exercise in concrete thinking. Now I want you to close your eyes and try to imagine visually in your mind's eye God the Father. And I'll ask people, what do you see? And then go to the board. We don't have time to do it in this session. I'll go to the board and I'll list the things that people say. People will say, I see a flash of lightning. A person has said, I see a volcano erupting. Another person say, I see this vast, brilliant, bright light. Another person will say, I see an old man with a beard. One person told me they saw a great big button, like the ultimate button that if you push the button, the universe explodes. And go through all of these different images. Inevitably, people will say to me, I see love, and then I have to say, what do you mean you see love? What does love look like? In other words, what they mean is that the word God conjures up feelings similar to the word love conjuring up in their soul, but you can't see love. Love cannot be concretely imagined. And the interesting thing that I've discovered from all of this is that if I would make up lists of answers, I've done this with preschool children, 5 years old, 4 years old. I've done it with communicants class children. I've done it with high school kids, college kids, seminary seniors, theology professors, every conceivable element or level of theological sophistication. And when you get the lists, you can't tell the difference. You can't tell who was the 5-year-old and who was the PhD when it comes to explicit, graphic, concrete images of God the Father. And then the next part, I'll say, okay, when I ask you to visualize God the Father, you see an old man in a beard, or you see a volcano erupting. How many of you actually believe that God is an erupting volcano? And people say, well, no, he's not an erupting volcano. But he's like an erupting volcano. There is something about that erupting volcano that suggests something that is a part of the character of God. God is not a bright light, but there is something that light suggests that says something to me about God. And so what we're getting at here is that our language about God is built upon analogy. I talked to a professor of philosophy last week, and he made the statement to me. He said, can you know anything about God from nature? And I said, yes. I said, God reveals himself in nature, and not only does God reveal himself in nature, but everything in nature reveals something about God. And this professor was horrified by that statement. He said, that can't be. And he says, show me something in nature that'll tell you something about God. And we were standing in the kitchen, and I grabbed a tea towel. And I said, this tea towel tells you something about God. And he says, that's absurd. And he said, what else? And I said, I walked over to him, I said, your shoe. I took his shoe. I said, that shoe tells you something about God, right? And he was getting angry. He said, oh, are you trying to tell me that God is a 9.5 M? Or that God is black and shiny? Or that God has a rubber heel on him? I said, no. But that shoe says many things. First of all, it's aesthetically pleasing. It has a dimension of form that is designed for aesthetic purposes. And I said, that shoe, in a certain sense, is beautiful. In an analogous way, God is beautiful. Not only this, but this shoe is functionally useful. And everything that's functionally useful in this universe calls attention to the order and the harmony and the utility that is in the mind of the Creator, who creates things for a purpose. And the fact that man has created this shoe for a purpose in an indirect way reveals something of the nature of God. So that even a shoe speaks of God. Like we read in the New Testament, you know, when the disciples were getting all excited, and John the Baptist and so on, heralding Jesus, and they told him to be quiet, and they said, if we be quiet, the stones will cry out. Well, the fact of the matter is, the stones have been crying out. Since the creation of the world, the stones have been crying out, revealing something about the nature of God. And as Calvin said, we have to be able to see God in every atom of the universe. But no atom, or the collection of atoms, is God. There is simply an analogy between them. An analogy is not an identity. That's the crucial problem that we have in theology. That we have a tendency to swing between two poles, okay? The pole of skepticism, which assumes that our language is utterly meaningless and has no reference point to God, okay? Or we get over here where we think of what we can call this pantheism, or we can call it a triumphalism. But here on this form, we think that we have captured or contained God. We can't do that. Our language at best is language of analogy. What we can say is what God is like. But as soon as we equate whatever it is that we use to describe God with the essence of God himself, we have committed the error of thinking that the finite has contained the infinite. Okay. In the 19th century, we saw a crisis emerge where more and more and more theology was bringing God down to this world, where theology became this worldly, and God was being more and more identified with world history, the flow of history, nature, and we had a greater period of pantheism where everything was God and God is everything in the 19th century than we've ever had before. And it was against that reaction that Karl Barth, for example, at the beginning of this century, objected to this stripping God of his transcendent majesty and making him part of the created order. That you saw a reaction from neo-Orthodox theology that was designed to restore the transcendent glory of God. But in his zeal to do that, Barth introduced a phrase, unfortunately and sadly, that has caused grave consequences to 20th century thought. He said, God is wholly other. Totaliter, aliter. Wholly other. And I remember, again, speaking with some theologians about this point, and they said to me, citing Barth's phrase, God is wholly other. And I raised this simple question to them. I said, if God, it's the same question I raised earlier, if God is wholly other, how do you know anything about him? And they immediately replied, because God has revealed himself. And I said, you haven't felt the weight of my question. My question is, if God is wholly other, that is utterly dissimilar from us, how can he reveal himself? What means would God use to reveal himself? I'm asking you that. Could he reveal himself through that shoe? Could he reveal himself through a sunset? Could he reveal himself through Jesus of Nazareth? If he were wholly other from human flesh or from human beings, what common basis for speech or communication would there ever be? Do you feel the force of that? The theologians finally got it. I had to ask them 4 times, and finally they said, well, I guess we shouldn't have said that God is wholly other. I guess not. You shouldn't have said that God is wholly other. Because if God is wholly other, that is utterly dissimilar from us, there is no possibility for any communication to take place between God and man. Get rid of analogy, and you end in skepticism, which is exactly where theology is right now in the 20th century. Now, the reason why theologians struggle with this is they recognize that these limitations exist in our knowledge of God. For example, we find in the Bible what we call anthropomorphic language. What is anthropomorphic? What's anthropology? It's the science of man. The Greek word for man, anthropos. The Greek word for form is morphos. And so anthropomorphic simply means something that is in the form of man. If I say to you that the cattle on 1,000 hills are God's, do you take that literally? Does that mean when the Bible says that the cattle on 1,000 hills are God's, that God is a great big rancher in the sky? So many head of livestock? You know that's not what it means. What does it mean? It calls attention to God's strength, to God's power, to God's ownership, doesn't it? But we don't take it literally because we recognize in that very concrete image that we are involved with anthropomorphic language. But what about when we speak about the omnipotence of God, or the infinity of God, or any of those terms that are very abstract and heavy theological terms? Have we moved beyond anthropomorphic language?
No.
Not at all. We have become more abstract. We have become more technical. We've become more theological. But even the most technical language that we use in theology is still anthropomorphic. All of our language, whether it's about God or about trains or about flowers, is anthropomorphic language. Do you know why? Because we're anthropoi. And we can never get beyond our humanness, because the finite cannot contain the infinite. And the only language we have is finite language. Okay, then so does that mean we can never get beyond ourselves? No. Because there is a point of contact between man and God. The Bible tells us that we are created in the image of God, so that there is some sense in which man is like God. That's what makes it possible for communication to occur, because God has built it into creation. He does not make us little gods. We are not to be identified with God, but we are like God in some way, because we are created in His image and in His likeness. And that makes it possible for God to speak, to reveal Himself to us, not in His language, but in our language. He can talk to us. He can communicate to us in a way that we can understand, not comprehensively, not exhaustively, but meaningfully, significantly, and really. And what we're going to do then is look at what God has revealed by His name and by His Scripture.